Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Feudernick, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today because we're going to get a perspective from a successful educational leader who has witnessed and had to respond to our educational divides, the polarization, and the culture wars playing out in many communities from a very unique perspective. My guest is Katy Anthes. Dr. Anthes was Commissioner of Education in Colorado from 2016 to 2023 and is widely respected for her commitment to listen to diverse perspectives. She has a track record of developing solutions that are founded on productive middle ground, which of course makes her a great guest for this podcast. She is currently the creator and director of the Forward Initiative at the Public Education and Business Coalition, as well as a founder and partner of the Third Mile Group, a social policy consulting firm. The Forward Initiative, From Polarization to Progress, prepares leaders in public policy to prevent and manage political polarization in their communities and workplaces. I'm pleased to say Katy recently agreed to join the advisory board for this project. Welcome, Katy.
Hi, thanks, Ken. I'm glad to be with you.
Terrific. I'm glad you're here too. If you would say a bit about your work in education and a couple of key things you learned while being Commissioner of Education in Colorado.
Yeah, well, I was commissioner for 7 years, but I was as a senior executive at the Colorado Department of Education for about 12 total. Colorado has a unique governance structure. The commissioner is appointed by a politically elected board of education. So sometimes commissioners are elected, sometimes they're appointed by the governor, but Colorado is one of 6 states that has its own politically elected board. And what that does is it provides lots of opportunity to have to manage differing perspectives because Colorado has many, many conservative communities and we have many, many liberal communities. And both of those communities were represented on my state board and they hired me. So part of my entire role at the department was to find a vision that we could all agree on and to keep board meetings in a productive place of conflict, not in a destructive place of conflict. And there were many, many things that split our board, but my role was to keep bringing them back to common ground and keep bringing them back to respect.
Thinking back on that experience, I'm sure there are some challenges that you faced where there was pretty wide divides and a lot of polarization on particular issues. Can you share a couple of examples of things that you had to confront and deal with?
Well, there were probably some of the things that you think about right now, which is, how we support at the state level standards for students and what are included in those standards. So the specifics of what are included around what we want our students to know and be able to do did get controversial at some point. So thinking about how we teach American history and how we teach about slavery and some of the not so savory things that our country did do and how do we help our students understand that? That created some division around our conservative members and our liberal members. We also had division around testing, around standardized testing and what role that should play in an education system. And then, of course, I was commissioner over the COVID years. And so there was a lot of division, I think, as we all experienced around masking or no masking, vaccines or no vaccines, closing schools or keeping schools open. There was a lot of division around some of those issues.
Katy, let me ask you about one of the things that you raised, because it's fascinated me. And the more I've had a few conversations with people, both conservative and liberal, about curriculum. You alluded to the standards and what it is that teachers and in Colorado, but I would assume in every state are required to teach when it comes to history. And, there's no arguing against the idea that we have like every society, a checkered past. There are things and the reason we study history, presumably, is we can learn not to do things that have been wrong and have been mistakes. And so we look at the ugly past. But when you get resistance from, you said, conservative members of in Colorado, what do you think? Do you think is that they really just don't want those stories told, or is there some understory there, something else going on in your mind?
Yeah. Well, you bring up a good point. I always think it's more complicated than it seems at the surface. And that's one of the things I teach now in workshops about how to decrease polarization is none of these issues and how they're portrayed in the media or how they're portrayed on Twitter or on anything else is so simple. So I don't think it's just that conservatives don't want to tell the story of, we'll just use one example, slavery. But I think they have fear around how the story is told, how it's placed in the context of our larger ideals as America, and how I have heard this from some, how it might make people feel. I don't agree with this, but how it might make, some people say that it might shame white people or children that are in schools learning about this. They don't want those children to be shamed. Now, I happen to believe that learning about shameful pasts is helpful no matter what race or religion or anything you belong to, because it helps provide context. But we have to acknowledge those things, and we have to talk through them, and we have to talk through them in a way that shows the complexity. And so in Colorado, we ended up having a very inclusive set of standards where we teach everything about our history and the facts about it. But we did have a robust discussion about how that was taught, and left a lot, for local communities to make that determination. Because in Colorado, we put the standards in place, the things you have to teach about, but the curriculum is the purview of the local district and the local school board.
One of the lessons that I learned from an interview I did a couple of years ago with a history teacher from Fremont, California, which is in the Bay Area, but it tends to be a pretty conservative community. But this is a teacher who really believes and that she needs to teach history honestly, and she is able to do it. And her principal was actually in on the interview saying, I completely support what she does. And the reason I can support it and not worry about it is that she has reached out and for years has great relationships with parents. They know what she's teaching, how she's teaching, and why. And she invites parents in to some of their events, and they trust her. And so they know that she's simply trying to get kids to learn about our history, and she's not trying to shame people.
Mhm.
And so her parents trust her, and it's through conversation and building up of trust with the community and parents that allows her to do that. I think there's an important lesson to be learned there.
Yeah, I completely agree. A lot of polarization and what our friend Amanda Ripley calls high conflict, which is destructive conflict, comes from when communities and parents and trust is broken. And so one thing we need to do to prevent polarization or prevent high conflict is to build up that trust and to keep the lines of communication with our parents, with our communities open, and to not be afraid of having what I call healthy conflict. Because my work is not at all about avoiding conflict. Conflict is a healthy, important part of our democracy. It's an important part of us growing It's an important part of school systems growing. We have to have different perspectives to push our thinking. But what we need to do is make sure that that conflict stays in the healthy realm. And in order to do that, you have to build trust, you have to open your doors, you have to meet with people you disagree with, you have to have kind of norms about how we disagree and how we can talk about things that we don't see eye to eye on.
Amanda, in my interview with her, and she's written about this, I'm sure you've have heard her say this and write this, that we need more conflict, not less, but of the type that you just described, healthy conflict where we can be pretty sure that we actually understand where people on another side of an issue are coming from. And often we don't. We make assumptions. We assume that if they're on the other side, that they probably adhere to the most extreme versions of a particular point on the other side rather than what they often. And so by creating situations where we're listening to each other and clarifying, did I get that right? Um, we can sometimes dispense with the errors and the misunderstandings. And then we can come down and say, I think we probably really do disagree about it. And we have to agree to disagree and maybe focus on something where we can agree and try to make that work. But let me just ask you if you think, with all of your experience working at that level in Colorado, with what is used to be a red state and became purple and now tends to be blue. But do you think we're hopelessly divided? Can our schools survive this polarization? What's your sense? Are you optimistic or less so?
Oh, you got to catch me on different days, but I tend to be an optimistic person. I will admit that there are some days in that I feel a little bit deflated with our polarization. But what I will say is I truly believe in my heart that we are not hopelessly divided. But what I also know is that the the media, the news stories, the cable news channels, the social media portrays us as hopelessly divided, which means that we don't even try to see the other perspective because we say, oh, we make all those assumptions you were just talking about. Oh, well, they think this, that, and the other thing. And so I'm not even going to try to respect them, or I'm not even going to try to understand them because I have no respect for that issue. But what they're doing is making assumptions. So what we have to do is dig under the surface of what the media is telling us. There are several organizations that are showing us we're not as divided as we think we are. The More in Common organization and the Starts With Us organization, you can go to their websites and you can do a quiz that can show you that we're not as polarized as we think we are. And so I think we just have to seek understanding and really dig under the surface. I can honestly say that one of my biggest supporters, and I'm a supporter of his as well, was the person I disagreed with the most on the board. And when I started, I had a lot of assumptions about him. And I'm sure he had some assumptions about me too. But we worked over 7 years to carefully, thoughtfully, and sometimes tiptoeing, build trust with each other. And then I could say to him, once we had that trust, I could say in a private space with him, hey, tell me what you really think about this. Like, I know
Mhm.
we disagree, so let's start there, but let's have you're the only person I can talk to about this. Like, I want to really know where you're coming from here. And he was one of the people that helped me see like where the conservative community was coming from on some of the standards issues, because I really truly didn't understand it. And so, but because I had trust with him, I could ask him some open, vulnerable questions in a private setting, so we could have that conversation.
Yeah, just a couple of words that come to mind that you said is developing trust. If you're, I think it's Amanda Ripley who we've referenced earlier, says in order to get anyone that thinks differently than us to consider our point of view, we have to become hearable. We
Mhm.
have to, and 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 that usually means developing trust and getting to know another person and hearing them and trying to understand them. And when we do that, people will often let their guard down and say, I'm curious to know what you think because now I trust you and I realize
Yeah.
that your intentions are good. We may not agree, but we need to continue the conversation so we can figure out. Because, ultimately, what's really fascinating to me about education is survey after survey that I've read when people ask cross sections of Americans what they want for their children, what they
Mhm.
expect from their schools, they generally agree.
Very similar.
Uh,
Yeah. Yep.
it's when
And
you start,
that's
yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
our job as leaders is to show people, and that's why like my work now is focused on coaching and workshopping with leaders about how can you be a solution in this problem? And one of the ways you can be a solution is help people realize that they're not as far apart as they think they are. And when you have individual conversations with people and you build trust individually, you can actually be the bridge builder between them and break down some of those assumptions and barriers.
So, Katie, when I did an intro about you at the beginning, I mentioned that you are the track record of developing solutions that are founded on productive middle ground.
Mhm.
Some listening to this might say, you must have to compromise your values to do that. Is that true? Do you think that you've had to compromise your values to build bridges between people that think differently than you do?
I don't think so. And that is a common question I get is that, people will push back on me and say, I'm not going to compromise my beliefs or my values. And I'm not going to talk to somebody I disrespect in terms of, if they have beliefs and values that I think are abhorrent, like I'm not going to engage with them. And that's a tough thing. That's probably some of the hardest work I've had to do on myself, self-reflection. And as a leader is say, am I like if there's a situation where values are at play, how do I make sure I'm not compromising my values? And I do think, and William Early talks about this in his book called Possible. He's a conflict negotiator and he's done it in war-torn countries and he's done it at the highest level for presidents, Republican and Democrat. And he talks about we often think things are binary or compromises are binary. And there are often compromises and middle ground you can find that you don't compromise your values. And you can find a win-win for both parties, even though it might not go as far as you want in any particular situation, you can make progress. And that's why the tagline for my initiative is, from polarization to progress. It doesn't mean you get everything you want. And our democracy has never been set up that way. That when we ended slavery, that was a good step forward, but there were a million things that Lyndon Johnson did not get, in that situation, or that Lincoln did not get when the proclamation was passed. So we have to still be able to make progress and move towards our values and hope that in the process we're educating each other on our values and how can we work towards all of them, and work towards a better situation.
You mentioned Abraham Lincoln. In the bridging work I do in my local community, and when I talk about that this work is not about no conflict, I remind people, or I remember reading about Lincoln, who surrounded himself in his cabinet with what people later called a team of rivals.
Yeah.
He insisted that his cabinet consisted of some people who were his rivals because he wanted their perspective. He knew if he was going to make progress, as you talked about, he was going to have to listen to people that otherwise might be barriers and would be fighting against him. And when he listened to them and tried to figure out how to find some middle ground. He learned and ultimately made more progress than many presidents have
Yeah.
that are less willing to do that. Let me just ask you a question about, whether this polarization that we're talking about is actually affecting student learning, and whether there are opportunities, or if you can point to examples of educators actually helping students to become less polarized in these times.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point because I think our students are learning from us, and in some cases, they're not seeing good models. In many cases, they're seeing good models, but it was always one of the most important things I thought about when I had a state board meeting because there would be students in the room, and I was like, we are modeling for them how we disagree. And sometimes it went well and sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, that's what I would beat myself up about, after the board meeting is like, that was not a good model for our kids. So I do think, the Civics Now Coalition is doing a ton of work on this throughout the country around how do we bolster civics education? How do we model dialogue and debate? How do we provide curricular resources to do this? And how do we engage our students in productive dialogue? So I do think it's happening, but I think we need to make it happen more. And I think we need to make it happen in real time, like at our school board meetings.
Yeah.
We need to model that type of leadership um, and and how we get our ideas on the table and how we negotiate them. So it's something I think about a lot. And it's something I think we need to do more of, actually, not less of.
Yeah. Just as we start bringing this to a close, to ask you, what questions are you pondering these days?
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this a little in the past, but one of the, biggest questions I get is how do you manage polarization and high conflict when we have these forces in our country right now that are fanning the flames of anger and fanning the flames of hate and maybe using misinformation? Again, our respected colleague Amanda Ripley talks about these people as conflict entrepreneurs. They're people that use conflict to drive wedges, and it happens a lot in our elections. But I think leaders I work with talk a lot about if you don't even have somebody to engage in these productive dialogue strategies, how do you manage that? So that's something I grapple with and would be curious to hear how you grapple with it.
Yeah, I since reading Amanda's book, High Conflict, I've become familiar with this concept of a conflict entrepreneur, which you referenced. And, these are people, as you say, who promote conflict for conflict's sake or for their own financial or political gain. So I think I've come to a place where I realize that in high conflict situations, there are sometimes conflict entrepreneurs, but there are other people sometimes that seem like conflict entrepreneurs that I've learned that really aren't. I think of an example, or an example that comes to mind is an interview I did with Willie Carver. I think it was a year and a half, 2 years ago. Willie is a high school teacher in Kentucky, who was Teacher of the Year, selected among tens of thousands of teachers, went to the White House along with 49 other teachers and came back, and then he became the target of some very, very vile comments and rumors about him because he's a gay teacher, openly gay, and he has a club after school that allows kids that need a place to talk about struggles they're going through, whatever they happen to be. He says that kids that have been part of that have come back to him and said, were it not for you, I don't know that I would be alive. because of the things that they were going through. But he got so much harassment from a small number of parents that he didn't feel safe any longer and quit. In my interview with him, he says, I don't really blame them. They've been told by other people, and I think the other people he is referring to are conflict entrepreneurs uh, who are instilling this sense of fear that these teachers, gay teachers that are teaching your students are grooming your kids. And if you don't know any better, and if you don't know a Willie Carver and you're not in the classrooms, you haven't been in schools a long time, you go, they're doing what?
Mhm.
And he says he acknowledged, I understand why they're fearful. They just don't know me and what many of us are trying to do. The people that I want to hold accountable are the governors and the state leaders and the media that
Mhm.
are promoting these false stories, these false narratives about what people like myself are trying to do, and simply supporting kids and saying, we care about you. Um, we want you to be in school, and you matter.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
in some cases that saves lives. It certainly helps them come to school, and it has a big impact on what they're learning. And it also helps other people in school who may be inclined to get attention from others by making fun of other people, whatever it is that makes that happen, so that they become kinder and more
Mhm.
civil people. That's something I think, going back to what do we expect schools to do, in addition to having them learn the content and learn skills and knowledge, we want them to be kind people, to be good citizens.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of our iconic people that we look up to, Martin Luther King Jr., um, the late Congressman John Lewis, other folks, they talk about things like fighting hate with love. And it's really hard to do. But what generally, when you become a really angry conflict entrepreneur, is you have a lot of fear and you have a lot of anger that has been created somewhere, whether it's misinformation or whatever. But you have some trauma in your life and I think that's where this idea, and some psychologists and other experts talk about that, like the only way to heal that is to come at it with understanding and love and as the person who you interviewed did and said, I don't blame them. I want to help them understand who I am. And so that's what I tell people to try to do. But I also recognize that you can be put in a fearful, challenging situation, and not everybody is equipped to, fight that type of anger in the moment. And so it takes like a really special person, and all of us can build those skills, but you can't, like, I understand that not everybody can do it in the moment when they're themselves are
Mm.
feeling threatened.
Yeah, yeah. It's often hard and challenging, but if we keep coming at it and keep trying, as you've done, and you pointed out that there were some times it just didn't work. It was hard, and some
Yeah.
days when you lose that sense of hope. I just want to comment on you referred to John Lewis and Martin Luther King. These are progressives, and called on us to love our enemies. There's a conservative guy named Arthur Brooks who heads up the American Enterprise Institute.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called Love Your Enemy. And one of the lines from that book goes something like this. And I think it's really wise observation that the more contempt we have for the other, the more others there will be.
Yeah.
And I share that sometimes with my own colleagues and friends that throw their hands up and they're so disgusted with the other side. And I think there's a bit of contempt I hear, and I have certainly felt it. And I just say, from a practical matter, from a practical perspective, if we have contempt for those people, we don't try to engage with them and become hearable ourselves,
Mhm.
there's going to be more of them.
Yeah.
And if we want to have if you have any hope that we might have a little bit of influence in getting someone to hear what we have to say, uh, then we have to have a bit of empathy, which is not endorsement, but it's being open to hearing them, engaging with them, and treating them as a human being.
Yeah. Yeah. I talk with about that a lot too, because some people will say to me, I shouldn't have to engage with people that are, doing X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, but if we don't engage, first of all, you might be surprised. Now, granted, you don't have to endorse what they just said publicly or anything like that. And you can disagree with people, and meeting with people does not mean you're compromising your values. But oftentimes we can bring people a little closer together, and you learn something about somebody who maybe, did say something that really offended you. But as you unpack that, it gives us a little more space to understand them as humans and see where they're coming from. And maybe we misunderstood. And it's a long, hard thing to do. It's a long road. But I feel like the place we're at in this country, we have to start down that road, or else it's just going to get worse and worse.
I think our communities are at risk, our schools are at risk, our democracy is at risk if we don't come together. And the thing that makes me optimistic it's just the findings I read from surveys that most people, 70, 80%, depending on the survey you look at, are exhausted with this polarization. They want to find a better way, and they're open to doing the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Yeah, we have to find a way to engage that exhausted majority. And most of them want to engage in constructive dialogue, and they think we can get there. But it's just some of these external forces that tell us we can't get there, or tell us we are the other, or tell us that the other is the other, so we don't want to engage with them. That prevents us from taking that first step.
So, Katy, when you look back on your career, your time spent as commissioner of education in Colorado, what comes to mind as a really proud moment for you?
Probably the proudest moment that I had, because it seemed to be sort of the culmination of the work I had done for the past decade, was when I was invited, after I announced my retirement from the commissionership, I was invited to a joint session of the House and Senate committee or the House and Senate full body in Colorado legislature. And after saying their thank yous to me and to their service, they opened the mic to any legislators who wanted to talk. And the head of the Republican Senate delegation came to the mic and talked about how much he liked working with me and how much I listened, and how he always felt that he could get a fair discussion with me and we could move forward on things together. And then after he sat down, the head of the Democratic Senate and House came up and said basically the same thing. And to get that type of endorsement from two parties that don't often regularly work together, I think was my proudest achievement.
Yeah, what a great testament to your work and your commitment that I alluded to at the top of the show, your commitment to finding common ground and to bridging our divides. So thanks so much for sharing that story.
Absolutely.
Well, Katy, I want to thank you so much for being part of this podcast, Courageous Conversations about our schools. Thank you so much for being here today with me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing. It's really important.
For listeners out there, you can hear this story and find episode notes about Katy and some of the work she's done at schoolconversations.org. And you can listen to this episode and all of our episodes wherever you get your podcast. Bye, everyone.